Happy Earth Day 2020, everybody. You found me out at one of the apiaries that I manage up north of Catherine, Kansas, off of Emerald Road. We've got a beautiful location out here, although when we're going to look around in a moment, it looks pretty brown, but that's going to be a few weeks from now. We're going to see millions of sweet yellow clover flowers all over out here. And the honey bee hives behind me, several of these have survived the winter and are getting geared up for the coming year, and the rest of them are brand new beehives that just started this spring. So we'll see how they do throughout the season. There may be some bees just coming and going from the front porch, if you can see any of that. But when those bees leave that hive and they're searching for flowers, for nectar and pollen, they're going to travel up to about 2.5, maybe even 3 miles. If we do some quick math, that's about 12 to 15,000 acres that those bees are going to be searching for what's blooming today. Now, today it's looking pretty brown out here, as I mentioned, but in a few weeks, it's going to be a veritable sea of yellow flowers out here, of sweet yellow clover, followed by sweet white clover, and some other wildflowers throughout the rest of the season. The yellow clover will often give us a beautiful light-colored honey, just like this. Many of you are used to seeing honey that looks a little more of an amber color. This is the normal honey I'd say that we get throughout the rest of the season. But the early spring flowers seem to produce a much lighter colored honey, and as you can imagine, it has a much lighter flavor also. Every honey is unique in their flavor, and sometimes we get a variety of darker honeys like this. They may come from sunflowers and other things that bloom later in the season, and it will have a much bolder flavor. They're all good. It's just a matter of personal preference on the flavor. If we look around out here behind me, you see a lot of brown flowers, plants and weeds and so forth. But if we were to look around the soil surface, there's a lot of green out here that we can't see just through the quick walking by vision. But later on, as I said, in about May, around Memorial Day, on through about wheat harvest, there will be an ocean of yellow colors, yellow-colored flowers behind us. So I'm going to suit up and look at some beehives. You hang on and enjoy the video. There's our queen bee right in the center of the frame. As you'll hear in the video in a moment, her job on a busy spring and summer day is to lay up to 2,000 eggs in a single day. Right now she's not doing any of that because she's been a little bit disturbed because we've got her outside of her normally dark hive. But there she is. You can see she is much larger than the regular worker bees. And all this area out here is brood that is capped and will be hatching in just a few days. They've got a little bit of honey stored up here in this corner and up in this corner. And that's kind of a typical looking hive. These areas here that are open have just hatched recently. But there goes our queen again, right there. She's a busy lady. There's the queen. Tool, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, there she is.
Seen our queen. We've seen an example of her brood. She's doing a great job of egg laying and so forth. Welcome to Hayes Public Library Herb Day 2020. We're recording this on Earth Day, as a matter of fact, just a couple days before. We've got a beautiful day of weather, and it's been a wonderful time. Here I am working at home, home in my home office, so hopefully this video finds you okay. You can hear everything all right. This is my first attempt at doing such a thing. We'll see how it all works anyway. So the title or subtitle of my
topic here is a little teeny bit of what you should know about honeybees. Now, I say a little teeny bit because we could talk for days on end about honeybees and a lot of things to know about them, and we still would barely scratch the surface. But we're going to give it a try to give you a little bit of some good general information about working with honeybees here in central and western Kansas. My name is Greg Swob. I'm with Swob Honey Farm. My brother and I began this venture back in 1978 as a college project. And we haven't kept bees all the time in those 42 years, but pretty much most of the time anyway. So we both manage between us. I'm going to have to estimate. I don't know how many beehives he has, but around the 60 number of hives. We work several different farmers markets selling honey and honey products. We do beginning beekeeper education training through Hayes Public Library, Sternberg Museum, and always available, seems like, for public presentations or to go to schools, 4-H groups, and so forth. We have a lot of fun with this hobby anyway. So why would one want to consider beekeeping as a hobby? You know, it's a very therapeutic hobby. I know a lot of beekeepers have a backyard hive. We'll set up a lawn chair out there and maybe on a nice summer afternoon, take a glass of iced tea and just watch the bees coming and going. It can be so relaxing and kind of paying attention to what they're bringing back. And when I talk about bringing back, there's some things that you can see, and we'll look at some of those here in a little bit. It's very fascinating, though. It can be rewarding because you've got honey at the end of the year, hopefully. It can also be frustrating. In America, we are losing, whether we are an experienced beekeeper of 40 years or a very first season, we are losing about 40% of our beehives throughout the course of the winter. So that's kind of the frustrating part. Back in the 1970s, when we began this hobby, that was not a problem. If you lost 5 or 10% of your beehives, that was a bad year. But today things are a little bit different. We have some diseases and pests and a variety of things happening, pesticides and so forth that were not around in the 1970s that we're dealing with today. There's no one smoking gun that's causing the beehive losses. There are a lot of potential things, and there's maybe a combination of things, but we don't have time to talk about that scenario. I just want people to be aware that that the bees dying situation has not completely gone away. It is still among us, but the industry is working very hard to try to overcome all this. Probably the most important reason one should consider beekeeping, or at least what I think of embracing the honeybee anyway, is pollination. About a third of the food we eat is produced thanks to managed pollinators. Now, there are also native pollinators. We have bumblebees and all kinds of little creatures that crawl around flowers and spread pollen around, and they are a very important part of the ecosystem also. For example, if you like growing tomatoes, a honeybee is not a powerful enough insect to pollinate a tomato plant, but a bumblebee sure is. I've been out of my garden in the years past and have heard a buzzing sound to turn around and see a tomato plant just shaking like crazy with 2 or 3 bumblebees grasping flowers, knocking the pollen loose in their little vibration action. Honey, well, there's never a guarantee of a honey crop, and drought years like 2012, 2013 were just prime examples of that. And the reason is, if the soil moisture is in rare supply, the plants then can't produce nectar, which is a sweet, sugary solution that the honeybees will convert into honey. And on a drought year like we had several years ago, that was a situation. Many beekeepers in Kansas had either no honey crop or a very poor honey crop. Challenging. Oh man, this hobby makes you think. It makes you stay ahead of the bees if at all possible. Keep ahead of their diseases to prevent them and recognize them immediately if you can to stop them, or some of the pests that find their way into the beehives. And there are some external pests also. Some skunks have gotten to be quite smart and have learned how to scratch on the entrance of a hive, and as the bees come out to investigate, the skunk eats them as they come flying out. Several nights of visits from a skunk doing that will kind of change the attitude of your beehive. They may become a lot more defensive, and you can lose quite a few bees to some hungry skunks. And another reason to consider a hobby would be just doing your part to help with the honeybee situation that we spoke about earlier. So when a bee is crawling around in a flower, they've got a lot of hairy structures all over their bodies. And you can see those little golden dots on the hair of the honeybee, and those are clumps of pollen that are attaching to their. And the bee will clean themselves and pack all that pollen into a pollen sac or pollen basket that's on their back legs. If you ever go to a health food store and buy some bee pollen, you'll notice they're all little teeny tiny pellets, and those pellets came out of the pollen sac of a honey. Now, I never want to joke about mental health. We have a lot of family members and friends who are involved in the industry. But I always say, if you have kind of a farmer instinct and you're maybe a little bit out there, you like doing things that are unusual, and some people look at crazy working with an insect that may want to defend their house, and you're out there digging in that house. Where those two things cross, that may be you. That's us beekeepers. Now, there's a long time history of mankind with honeybees. If we look at the image on the upper left, those are some cave drawings that were found in Spain many years ago. They've been dated back about 7,000 years. Now, let's take a look at the photograph below that. That's a modern beekeeper. This photo was taken literally a couple of years ago. And these are Tibetan beekeepers who are working with an Asian honeybee. This Asian bee is extremely large. They don't live in beehives that man builds. They still put their combs out under cave overhangs or on the sides of mountains and so forth. And you may notice some smoke in the background. We'll talk about smoking honeybees after a bit. But I love the parallel between the cave drawing and the person in the photograph below. Although the modern beekeeper below has got the benefit of a bee protective suit that the caveman did not have some years back. Upper right-hand corner, the Egyptians did literally raise bees, where the cavemen were more of honey robbers, we'll say, or honey harvesters, if you want to give them some more benefits. But they didn't manage bees back then. But the Egyptians and a lot of other ancient cultures did manage honeybees. They raised them into a type of clay pot that was a hive. And until a gentleman named Lorenzo Langstroth came along in the 1800s, the hive was pretty much killed off at the end of the year, and the honeycomb was crushed, and the honey was strained out of that. And Mr. Langstroth came along and developed a system of frames that had wax honeycomb on them, and they were removable, made harvesting and inspecting and managing a beehive. It just revolutionized the industry. And his standard, even though it's 160 or so years old, is what's used today by most beekeepers. So where do we get honeybees? Well, the equipment itself, the beehive boxes and the bee suits and anything we may wear to protect ourselves can be purchased off the internet 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. But getting your honeybees is a pretty finite item. We start taking orders to sell packages of bees right about Christmas time. We already know then that we've got a partial truckload spoken for from one of the major bee suppliers out of Georgia. And we know the date they're arriving already 3 or 4 months ahead of time, and we start taking orders right around Christmas. Maybe a perfect Christmas gift? And along comes end of March, and also another load maybe in mid-late April, and now the bees are done. If you did not order maybe in January, February, March at the latest, you may be missing out on getting bee packages for the entire. Now, some beekeepers are known by their animal control people, and it may not be a bad idea once you start the hobby to let pest control companies and your animal control people know that you are a beekeeper and you're willing to maybe tackle a swarm. And what a swarm is, we have here, this photo is a congealing of maybe 10,000 or so honeybees. It's a reproductive swarm. The hive they emanated from, who knows where they came from. It could have been in a hollow tree, it could have been in a man-built beehive down the street or a mile away or so. And things were going well for the bees. They produced a secondary queen. The new queen stayed with the colony, stayed in the beehive, and the older queen left with maybe half or so of the bees that were in that hive. And right now on this peach tree, they're just congealed. They're just kind of in a staging, if you will. They probably already know where they're going. The scout bee may have found a hollow tree with an opening in it, or a building that has a little penetration that they found a pipe maybe enters a house, or a vacant garage or something that they found their way into, and that's where they're going to be headed here later today or maybe tomorrow. They'll only be in this kind of a situation for a few hours, a few minutes, or maybe a day or so. So timing is everything. When you get that call to collect a swarm from a pest control company because they do not like to kill honeybees, or the animal control people, if at all possible, you need to respond right away because the opportunity may be. Where else can we get honeybees? Well, sometimes beekeepers will be retiring from the hobby and they have live hives that they are selling. Some beekeepers produce bees for sale and you can buy the hive and everything. That's a little more rare, let's say, but it is always an opportunity that you may have to keep your eyes out for. My big tip would be the later in the year, walk away. If it is September and somebody is selling honeybees, since America, we're losing about 40% of our bees over winter, that would be a risk that I'm certainly not willing to take. If it's May or June, I would really consider that. Another way to purchase bees in the beekeeping industry, we call this type of hive a nuke or a nucleus hive. It's actually a complete beehive. There's a queen in there, workers, and a population in there. We can see in the middle that there's some honeycomb work being done. This colony has been together for a while, but they're outgrowing their box. So a nuke is just a transport case, if you will. You will remove these frames from this nucleus hive and put them into your standard beehive. But a nuke is another option for purchasing bees. And they're usually not available until May, maybe June. Again, later on from, say, wheat harvest time on, I would reconsider the purchase because it's just they may not have enough time to build up their honey supply they need for winter and so forth. It would be more of a gamble versus early. Now, when I was president of the Kansas Honey Producer Association a few years ago, we polled our members and discovered that we weren't surprised, but about 94% of our Kansas beekeepers utilize the Langstroth style beehive. And another 5 or 6% use a variety of other hives. For example, the one in the lower right-hand corner is a top bar hive, and this can be popular among some beekeepers. They're easy to work with. You don't have to lift, as you can see in the managed Langstroth style hive, as individual boxes that can be quite heavy. In the top bar hive, you're just lifting one frame inside at a time, so it's can be a lot easier to work with for some people. Winter survival is not very good in the top bar style hive in Kansas compared to a Langstroth style hive. So 40% may be a very lucky year of a loss with using an alternative hive from the Langstroth. Now, when replacing beehives, several things you want to look for. Fauna, flowers. It takes about 1 million flower visits to produce 1 pound of honey for the hive. And you think, well, that's a nice sized bottle of honey. But the beehive, throughout the year, that colony is going to consume 100 to 150 pounds of honey just feeding their young and taking care of themselves. They're going to need maybe 80 or so pounds to survive the winter. And if you're the beekeeper manager, you would like to maybe be able to harvest a little honey also. So we start adding all that up. We're seeing that hive throughout the course of the year may produce 300 to 400 pounds of honey. Of course, a lot of that is being consumed as they go along. And if it takes 1 million flowers to make 1 pound of honey, your little garden with 4 or 5 pepper plants and a couple mounds of squash and so forth aren't going to support a hive very well at all. But don't worry. When those honeybees leave that hive, they're searching an area that's 2 to 3 miles in radius. So we're talking 12,000 to 15,000 acres that they're scouring on a daily basis, looking for the right flower that's blooming that day. So when we're looking for places for honeybee hives, we look for the flower sources, water. Every animal needs water to survive. Excuse me. So in the country, we're going to look for a creek or a pond or livestock watering tanks or some kind of a water source nearby. Shelter. I prefer to put my bees, if at all possible, on the south side of a nice established windbreak. I'd like to leave them there all year round if the farmer is okay with that. And that way they've got some good protection from the winter weather. And I'm going to mow around them. You can see in this photo that we didn't mow a very big area around the hives, but today we mow a lot more. I've never lost beehives from a wildfire, but I know some beekeepers who have. And that would be very heartbreaking and frustrating. I joke about this one as Superman inspecting his hives, and actually, in my personal opinion, each honeybee should have a Superman S on on the chest of their thorax, because they do some things to save the world, and we're going to talk about that here in a moment. So maybe beekeeping isn't for me as a hobby, but what can I do to help them survive? Well, if we take a look at the beautiful green lawn in the upper left-hand corner, that's kind of what we've been taught in the last few decades that a lawn should look like. The lawn on the upper right-hand side, to me, is gorgeous. I'm looking at a variety of flowers blooming. There's henbit, and that beautiful purple color will only be there for a couple of weeks in the spring. And if people want to spray and kill that weed, they really should have done that in the fall, because once this little weed of henbit is blooming purple in the spring, it's too late. It's already dying. You're wasting pesticide to spray that. But as a beekeeper, I always say there's no such thing as a weed. You love and embrace these sort of things. In the background of the upper right-hand photo, we can see a variety of trees and so forth. There are maples and elm trees that bloom early in the year, provide a lot of pollen. No nectar, but they do provide pollen, which is a very high protein source that the bees feed their young. And the lower right-hand corner, as far as I'm concerned, that is what a yard should look like. That is gorgeous. A variety of flowers. Some are going to bloom in the early season in March, April, and May. We're looking for things always that bloom in July and such, because that's kind of a tough time of year. It seems once wheat harvest is done in Kansas, a lot of wild weeds are not blooming. They're done, or else they're not blooming yet. So it's hard to find that perfect nectar-producing plant that blooms in the summer. There's a movement out there that kind of takes a play on some words. Don't be a grasshole. And what they're trying to do is just simply encourage people to plant a variety of things in their yards. Maybe not the front yard. If you need to have a nice green yard for the street view, I understand. My yard is mowed well from the front, but the backyard, and I'm in the country, is a couple of acres of clover and alfalfa and asters and all kinds of wild flowers that are growing back there, and some things that I've planted also. Now, natural beehive, bees typically live in trees, and this one is in Hays, Kansas. It's near one of the elementary schools on an established older neighborhood. And this tree branch had been removed quite a few years ago. A few rotten spots have developed over time, and the arrows are pointing to bees that are flying. That may be a little hard to see unless you have a very large screen. This hive was high enough above the sidewalk in the street that basically nobody knew they were there except the homeowner happened to see some honeybees coming and going one evening, and that's how she was alerted that there was a colony in that tree, and they had been in there for years. The managed beehive, I mentioned Reverend Lorenzo Langstroth. In the 1800s, he developed a uniform size of box, if you use that term, or super is the word we typically use. The brood supers down below are deep boxes. They're 9 5/8 inches tall, and that's basically where we want the queen to stay and raise the young down there. She's not the caretaker, but she lays eggs. We're going to take a look at a queen here in a moment and see how much larger she is than a standard worker bee. And above the brood chamber boxes, there's many beekeepers will install something called a queen excluder, and it's basically a screen that a worker bee is small enough she can crawl through. But the queen and drones, because they're much larger, they cannot fit through the screening of this excluder. And all the boxes, supers that are on top of that are then designed for honey storage and honey harvesting later in the season. Now, who resides in our beehives? Who lives in our beehive? Well, we have the queen seen in the photograph on the left. She is much larger than the standard worker bees. Early on, a young virgin queen is not much bigger than a worker bee, but she's still a little bit larger. And in time, her abdomen will develop and so forth, because her job is laying about 2,000 eggs a day in the spring and early summer. So she has to have a large abdomen to hold that many eggs as they're being produced at a time. She's also surrounded 24 hours a day by a retinue of worker bees that feed her, protect her, literally clean up after her, because if you're busy laying 2,000 eggs a day, that's one egg every few seconds. She's a busy job. She's a busy lady. The drone bee, on the other hand, on the right-hand side, we can see that he's also quite a bit larger than the worker bees. He has no stinger. He cannot defend the hive because of that. He has no job, basically, as far as house cleaning. He does not collect pollen. He doesn't collect nectar. He doesn't do anything around the hive, except his job is to every day leave that hive, say mid-late morning, go to a congregating area where other drones are and look for a virgin queen to come flying by and hopefully be involved in a mating procedure. The queens only mate one time, but they'll mate with multiple drones during that one time. This may go on for several days, and as the drone who is successfully mating with the queen, the reproductive system is literally ripped off his body and stays with that queen for a period of time, so he perishes during the mating process, or following it anyway. And in wintertime, or before winter, worker bees will literally drag the drones out of the beehive because they're kind of dead weight in the winter. They're another mouth to feed. They don't need to be mating with any queens in the middle of winter. So basically in the wintertime, the only critters living in that hive, or should be in that hive, would be the queen bee and worker bees. The worker bees are all female. They're all sterile. Under rare conditions will they lay an egg, and that's another conversation entirely by itself. But if they do lay an egg, it will result in a drone if it survives at all, because they're not fertilized. They have never been mated. So what kind of equipment do I need? Well, I think the upper right-hand corner is probably about the most important single item. Honeybees will defend their hive, their nest, their box, their home, just as you would. So you may want to have a veil to protect you from an accidental sting anywhere in the face. Stings on the arm or hands are really not anything but a little minor occurrence, if you will, to most of us. Although a small percentage of the population, about 0.5% or less of the people, fortunately it's less, is they have problems. If they are stung by a honeybee, they may have a serious allergic reaction. So that's probably something you should determine early on before you decide in this hobby and invest into it, is, am I allergic to bee stings or not? So I do suggest people maybe help a friend of theirs work their bees and do something to get stung to make sure that their reaction is just maybe a typical little bit of pain and maybe a little itching for a day afterwards at the sting site, and not that their throat swells up or their lips swell up or they have difficulty breathing and end up having to go to the emergency room. That's what we don't want to have happen to you. And hopefully you'll be in the majority of people and have no issue whatsoever with bee stings. If you do, you probably better really reconsider the hobby. The smoker on the left-hand side, upper left, is designed for two purposes. The bees that live in the trees in the wild, well, when they smell smoke, there's a forest fire nearby, possibly. So they may have to lose their home. One thing they will do is gorge themselves upon honey, and they're ready to take flight if they have to go to a new home, a new tree, a new cave, or a new area in the wild. The other thing that the smokers do is bees communicate by pheromones, and they have an alarm pheromone scent that the guard bees, once someone opens up their beehive, will start emitting this odor. And they say, oh, we have an intruder in our house. And what the smoker does then is just masks that scent from the other bees, so they don't really think anything unusual is happening, although now all of a sudden we have a skylight. Our hive was dark and now it's not. But the smoke does hide that alarm scent. The tool in the middle upper is a hive tool. There are a variety of those around. All of mine have a hook on the end. I just find that I prefer that to pry things loose in the hive. Bees tend to glue things down. They want to make sure nothing shifts within their hive, and things get stuck down quite well. The tool on the right-hand side, we don't use a whole lot, but it's an uncapping fork, and that's done during honey harvest time. The bee brush on the lower left is used quite often because we may remove a frame from the hive and want to inspect the health and condition of the larvae or the brood that's in there. And you may have to use a brush not to sweep the bees away, but to maybe flick one or two that are blocking your view. And gloves are good to have just in case a bee wants to sting you on the hand. If you work with a computer or what have you, it's much easier to do that without fat fingers from a series of stings. So I always wear a veil and usually wear gloves when I'm working with my bees. And with that protective equipment, that's enough that I basically hardly ever, if ever, stung. And then there's a jar in the lower right-hand corner. When we first get our package or our nucleus hive, we may need to feed them because they have to find their own nectar sources and such. And it gives them some energy to build wax and comb with. That takes a lot of energy. A lot of carbohydrates are necessary. Some beekeepers will also add mineral oils and so forth, not mineral oil, but oils to them like lemongrass oil and mints and such to help control certain diseases and entice the bees to enjoy that syrup more. But that's perfectly optional. The one tool I do not have a photo of here that a person needs or piece of equipment, and that's kind of a bad word to use, is a mentor. A mentor would be a human being who hopefully lives nearby you, who knows your limitations, and is able to help you answer questions. You open up your hive and you smell something odd. You've got this person you can call. Man, what's going on in there? Or I'm seeing this, or I'm experiencing that. What does that mean? Or maybe this person can come to your hive and open it up with you and look around and say, oh, things look good. Look for this and look for that. Do you see this? It's good to have that person. Books, there are all kinds of books out there, and I can't recommend any one particular book because I haven't read them all because there's so doggone many, but there are a lot of beekeeping books out there. You might want to invest in some for certain. There's some other equipment that you may want to work your way up to. The items on the previous slide are first year stuff. I've got to have a veil. You've got to have a veil. A smoker is maybe not absolutely necessary, but you'll find that working with the bees is a lot easier if you have one. Hive tool, many things can be utilized as a hive tool. I've forgotten my hive tool before and had to use a screwdriver and once even a machete. That's a story in itself, but those things don't make very good hive tools. So I highly recommend having maybe a spare, just in case, because you may drop one and lose it in the grass or weeds and find it the next day when you come back. But it's not a bad idea to have an extra one. But later on, you might want to build some kind of a toolbox or purchase one that all these items can be carried conveniently to your site. Now, if you have one beehive in the backyard, it's not a big deal at all to transport a couple of things or to make 2 or 3 trips from the garage or the garden shed. But if you have several out yards, as I do, and they're maybe 18 to 20 miles away from one another, it's good to have something to carry all your equipment in. The lower left-hand corner is used at harvesting. This is a heated knife. We'll take a look at a frame of honey later on from a hive that is ready to harvest. These hot knives will cut the honeycomb open so that the honey can flow. A strainer in the middle sits on a bucket. The wings on the side expand to fit onto a 5-gallon bucket. The lower right-hand item is a heated storage tank. That's something a first-year beekeeper is pretty good investment, pretty substantial investment. I would say work up to something like that as time goes by. Same thing with the motorized extractor in the upper right-hand corner. If you are in the Hayes area and you're ready to harvest some honey, I have a kit that has everything that a person would need. All we ask for is a small donation, if you will, and that's voluntary, to our foundation called Bee Lives Matter. And the Bee Lives Matter, for a quick plug, we donate money to bee research organizations and other entities and so forth who help the beekeeping industry. And it's just a little fundraising thing that we do. So anyway, there's a plethora of beekeeping equipment available today. When my brother and I started in 1978, Sears Roebuck Company is where we got our equipment and our bees, as a matter of fact. They had a farm and ranch catalog that was about that thick. Today, the beekeeping supply catalogs alone are about that thick. The variety of equipment that was back in the Sears catalog in the 1970s was 2 to 4 pages, as I recall. And today, there may be 100 pages of items that we can purchase. So a lot of things are not necessary, and a lot of those things are quite essential. A bee suit is another thing a person may want to invest in. In the lower right-hand corner is just a jacket that protects you from the waist up. And that's what I use for almost all of my normal routine inspections. The lady in the middle is wearing a full-length body bee suit. There are different styles of hats. I prefer the round hat. I get more vision and so forth. Many people prefer the fencing style hat as seen in the middle. And the gentleman on the left is from Slovenia. He must be at a beekeeping convention of some sort. He's not wearing a bee suit. He's wearing a suit of bees. I highly suggest you don't try that early on in your beekeeping. So what kind of bees? Man, talk to your mentor. That's the best advice I'd have. They'll give you a suggestion of maybe what the best variety is for your region. We primarily use 2 varieties of honeybees, the Italian honeybee or the New World Carniolan. They just do a pretty darn good job in our area. The Italian is the workhorse of the honeybee, and most of the other varieties are a derivative of the Italian bee. You can also purchase Russians. They're a unique bee in that they can handle certain pests better than most honeybees do. And they also have a little bit more of an attitude that that a lot of honeybees do not. They're not as aggressive as the Africanized honeybees are, but some people will caution that they have to be completely suited up while they're still inside their vehicle before they get out, because the Russians are greeting them at the door immediately when they get out of their car. The Caucasian is another variety of honeybee. There are so many others. There was a bee a number of years ago called the Midnights, and they were very calm. They were just known to never sting a person. Problem was they couldn't manage their hive very well against a lot of pests that want to enter the hive. So they're basically, because they're so tame and so gentle, they're non-existent. There may be some still available. I have no idea who raises that honeybee. Probably more of research than anything else. But they may be available, but I'm going to say you'll have a challenge finding them. And I jokingly refer to some honeybees as called the Kardashians. Maybe a good-looking hive and nicely populated. They appear to be working well. They're just not producing much honey compared to the rest of them in this same group. So I jokingly call those Kardashians because they're good-looking bees and just don't do much of a living. But what you're going to look for and what your mentor will recommend for you, find some bees that overwinter well in our area, that build up quickly in the spring, because when our weeds and things start to bloom, it happens fast. Apricot trees bloom very early in the year, and you can't have a tiny little cluster of bees and expect them to populate everywhere, pollinate every tree in the area that's blooming. Peach trees and such start blooming in April, and so you want your bees to build up early on so they're ready for the early heavy flows of nectar and pollen that happen. You want bees that produce well throughout the season. This is like a dream, isn't it? We want all this, and hopefully we can get it in the same bee. And we want bees that are gentle to work with. Well, as I mentioned, midnight bees just don't exist anymore. They were definitely gentle to work with. A varroa-sensitive hygiene trait is a great trait that's bred into a lot of the bees today. So you may look for a VSH. That's the varroa mite sensitive hygiene. They do a lot of work to clean the mite away from one another and do some other things to help manage that serious pest. We could talk about the varroa mite for hours and days on end because it is such a serious pest on the honeybees. They're like a tick. I don't have any photos in this slideshow of them, but as a tick may be able to give you or I Lyme disease or some other kind of a disease, but these varroa mites can give the honeybees a variety of viruses also. So it's been a genuinely tough pest to manage. So if we're learning the hobby, I mentioned earlier, get a book. Wintertime is best time to start thinking about your beekeeping hobby. Maybe get a book or two for Christmas, or visit your local library, or go out online, find a mentor, find some man or woman in your area who you can work with and who knows you well and will be willing to help you, and respect their time. Don't call them every day with questions, but if something serious is happening that you need a quick answer, make sure you have a good relationship with your mentor and treat them very well. Internet and YouTube, all kinds of things out there. And I suggest you just beware. It's tough for a beginning beekeeper to know who is an expert out there and who is just kind of blowing smoke, if you want to use that expression. I used to think that to become an expert beekeeper, it took years of practice and experience. And today I've learned that all you need is a camera and a YouTube account, and you can call yourself an expert. So there's a lot of good stuff out there. There's a lot of trash out there also. You just have to beware. Your mentor can probably steer you to the right sites or the right books to invest into. If you get really serious about beekeeping, there are some master beekeeping courses available. Montana State University has had one for a number of years. The University of Nebraska used to, and when Dr. Ellis retired a few years ago, the program went away, but it's coming back. It's called the Golden Prairie Beekeepers, and I'm helping participate in their first year of the Master Beekeeper class, and really excited about that. We, basically me, host a local beekeeper beginning class at the Hayes Public Library. I taught it also at the Sternberg Museum We never charge for this sort of thing, or usually you don't anyway. When we taught at Sternberg, the Sternberg Museum charged. I did not. I was a volunteer for the museum. So, but we teach beginning beekeeping classes in the wintertime. Western Kansas Beekeepers Association. We have a Facebook now, and since we cannot meet in groups because of the coronavirus, we're using a newsletter to communicate, and we may try some other sources. We used to formally meet every other month, and we would meet in Hays, Kansas at Professor's Sandwich Shop or at Dodge City at the fairgrounds. We've got a very nice facility down there. And we would move those meetings back and forth so the same people didn't have to travel large distances every time, or the same distance, I should say. North Central Kansas Beekeepers, they meet in Salina the second Sunday of every even month, so like April and June and so forth would be their meeting times. And again, I don't know what they're doing to meet right now because of the coronavirus situation, but I know they have a Facebook site, and there's a lot of conversations on there. I'm past president of the Kansas Honey Producers Association, and we have 2 large conferences every year. Again, once the corona issues are over with, hopefully we can have a fall conference here in 2020, and it will be at the Best Western Museum in Park City, Kansas. And we'll be meeting there for the next year or so, and decided that one central location to be repeated every time may be better than we used to move the meetings around. The spring 2020 meeting, for example, was held in Hays, Kansas, which was a nice commute for me anyway, because I'm just east of Hays, about 4 miles. So I like it when we met here about every 2 years. We would meet in Hays, but now we're going to meet at the Park City Best Western location. Go to their website, kanshoneyproducers.org, and any discussion of meetings and so forth will be out there. If you have some questions, maybe you have a swarm in a tree in your yard, or you're not a beekeeper and you're looking for somebody to help capture that, they will be able to connect you with somebody. Kansas State University has a bee swarm listing also. And just talk to your local animal control people, pest control people. They know beekeepers such as myself who are willing to come out and capture a swarm of bees. And it's a lot of fun to do that also. So here's what you're looking for in the fall. This is a frame of honey removed from a Langstroth style hive. It is completely capped over in that you notice that the honeycomb cells are not open. They're not exposed. They are, I'll draw something here. Each one of these is a capped cell of honey that it takes that hot knife or some other type of a device to remove that, to open up the comb so that they can be inserted into a extracting machine and extract the honey from there. As a beekeeper, you're going to harvest in August, September, sometimes October, depending on how busy you get. But usually August and September are the primary harvesting season. So when you're at the farmer's market, that's you're ready to go because you harvested already last fall. So rather than the people who are growing the tomatoes who are waiting for June and July to come along for the fruit to be setting, you've already got your crop. You can be one of the first people at the market. At the local farmer's market, you will find liquid honey, maybe comb honey, in the upper right-hand corner, or honey sticks, as they're referred to. They are a drinking straw that's sealed shut at each end, filled with either regular honey or flavored honey. Kids love those things. We sell a lot of them at the markets. And many beekeepers make lip balms and soaps, and a variety of lotions and potions can be made from honey and beeswax and other products in the hive. There's a plethora of books on products that you can make from things up. Now, I talked earlier about bees saving the world, and I think each bee should have a S Superman emblazed on their chest or their abdomen. Well, for example, Sarah Nansel, who's a graduate student at Fort Hays State University, she's working on a research project, and it's about to complete, I believe, this year. And some of her research is very promising. You know, we have a lot of illnesses caused by bacteria, such as staph and other infections. And those things are substantial. I mean, they are huge diseases if a person would happen to be cursed with one of them. And a lot of the diseases that have been used to treat them, the medications that have been used to treat those diseases are no longer effective. And the last time I spoke with Sarah, she said with a big smile that You'd be surprised what Kansas honey is killing. So there's some very promising things. I mentioned early on about the Egyptians. Well, one of the things that they used for their honey was in treating wounds. Honey is great for, most beekeepers I know are known to put honey on Band-Aids if they get a cut or a puncture wound or something like that. I've even heard of people using honey to help from brown recluse spider bites to help reduce scarring and so forth. Honey has a lot of good benefits medicinally. So it's not uncommon now for a modern emergency room to have honey-infused bandages for wound care treatments. Ryan Engel is another graduate student at Fort Hays State University. Now, his project is on pollen and pollen habits of honeybees. So that's not necessarily saving the world, but I think his research is going to help us beekeepers save our bees. We're going to understand the type of pollen that they collect a lot better once his research is completed. Oh my gosh, do honeybees have a sense of smell? It got to the point where there was an organization in Montana called Bee Awareness Technologies that a number of years ago, they were training honeybees using a reward situation. I don't know exactly how they did that, but the bees were trained to associate a reward with an explosive. They were trained to detect certain types of explosives and bombs and so forth. So in 2009, the United States Army had heard about this and was so interested, they did some testing with trained bomb-sniffing dogs versus bomb-sniffing honeybees. The honeybees were far more effective, statistically speaking. The problem is honeybees want to get back to doing what bees do, so they need to be retrained every few days because they want to go out there and look for flowers and not necessarily look for explosives, but they were incredibly effective. And we may ask, well, what's the purpose of this? Well, unfortunately, mankind has been very unkind to mankind over the centuries, and there are millions of landmines buried in certain parts of the world. And the belief from Bee Awareness Technology was if we could take our bees over to, say, Afghanistan or one of these, Vietnam or some of these nations, and we could release them and help find the landmines quickly and dispose of them quickly, save children and civilians' lives, that would expedite the removal and destruction of these mines versus having a human or livestock make contact with them. So this organization, I think, is very worthy. I haven't heard much about them lately, but I hope they're still doing some progress in their research. Bee venom. It's been tested. I'm not certain what laboratory or university is working on this, but they have discovered that bee venom can help destroy the virus that causes AIDS, the HIV virus. And I'm sure that somebody out there is now experimenting with bee venom and the coronavirus. Why not? If honeybees can save mankind from this pestilence, then just another win for them, win for us, a win for everybody. So I mentioned earlier that honey has been used as a medicine for thousands of years, and we're today catching up to where the Egyptians were 3,000 years ago of using honey again as a medicine. Cornell University a few years ago did some research with children's cough syrups, and they found that just honey is as good of a suppressant as, or better than the majority of the over-the-shelf cough suppressants for children. And the other thing was many kids had some allergic reactions to certain chemicals that were in the over-the-shelf or prescription cough suppressants, and they had no reaction to honey. The only problem with honey is it does have a few calories, so we don't want to give it to kids very often, but it's safe. It's not a drug. It's something that will help suppress a cough without causing some adverse side effect. This is normally where I would ask the crowd for questions because typically we're in a classroom setting. So this is where I'm going to say, if you do have some questions, contact me through my phone. If you wish, call or text 785-639-7766. Go visit the Kansas Honey Producers Organization website, kanshoneyproducers.org. There's not necessarily a question and answer area, but there is a section out there where it says contact us. So if you have some specific things that you're looking for, maybe someone to put honeybees on a crop you have that like canola or something on that order, cotton is benefits from those crops, both benefit from honeybees. You can contact that organization and they will connect you with a local beekeeper. Very worthwhile group. So for now, I say thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed your Earth Day and enjoy your Herb Day. Thank you.